Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. In this video, I'm going to be talking about putting the finishing touches on a master, including the subject we all love to hate and hate to love, loudness. How do we get a record loud? I think we've all had a situation where we've created a mix that we really love and we get it as loud as we can, and then we hear it next to another record that was maybe released recently and we're a lot quieter and we go, okay, let's see if we can get a little louder, and then things start to fall apart. So there are some techniques for getting something loud, and I'm going to discuss some of those in this video, but I want to start by saying that loudness does not really inherently come from the master. I mean, yes, it does in a certain sense, but we really have to prepare for a loud master as we're mixing. We have to understand that because there are certain technical limitations that come from a dynamically compressed record. That's going to involve things like really controlling our lowest bass elements. The Fletcher-Munson curve, which is how we hear things disproportionately across the frequency spectrum, requires that we have more energy in the lower frequencies in order to hear them on the same level as the upper mid frequencies, which means if you want somebody to hear a really deep 808 as loud as they're going to hear, say, a snare drum, you're going to have to turn that 808 up really loud, and that is going to eat up room in which you could use to get your record louder. So we have to do things like manage the bass. That might involve some kind of compression. It might also involve putting tones into the record through distortion that allow the bass to appear louder because there are upper, higher frequencies that take up less room that pull the ear to those tones. So techniques like that are mix techniques. We need to do that in a way where we can do it artfully in the mix for the purpose of both creating something that is aesthetically pleasing and also will get us a louder result. Now, a lot of the times, we don't want to do that. Sometimes we just want to mix the record, and I do have to say that a lot of the times with my clients, I have to have that discussion where I say, you know, this record might not get as loud as some of these other records, but at the end of the day, if the record feels better, if the groove is better, primarily that's really my main thing, if the groove is better, the record will generally do better, even if it's a hair quieter than, say, you know, the latest commercial release of whatever genre we're comparing ourselves with. Okay, but with all that said, we're here for mastering, we've got our mix, let's just work with what we've got. Okay, so let's play a little bit of this. We were working on this earlier this week, but let's recap real quick.
Winning, the whole of emotions are holding me back. I'm open and lonely and nobody asks. Can't cope with the slogans and too many ads. Accumulate bruising and negative habits. Perhaps as a rabbit that raps, I'll get enough cabbage to get someone to carry these bags. But who is the master? Who is the bastard?
Okay, so that's the verse, and I can tell you from the perspective of the verse, we have a very open arrangement. Loudness also comes from arrangement, too. The less elements there are, the less they fight each other as they start getting denser and denser, which is what happens when we compress the record more and more. If we start incurring distortion through whatever loudness techniques we're using, well, there's more space for things to become distorted but still have a sense of clarity and cleanness. Now, this is not cleanliness? There we go. But that's not really going to be the case when we get to the chorus.
And shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we...
The chorus has a lot more elements going on, and so when the chorus starts getting compressed and when we start incurring distortion from our limiting and compression, all the elements in there are going to start to crunch up a little bit. The more stuff that's in there, the more stuff that starts crunching, and the less room we have to actually get that distortion in there without it becoming offensive. So one tip is go to the densest section of the song, which is usually going to be the chorus, but wherever things are most harmonically dense and instrumentally dense, that's where we're going to want to get our loudness, because we don't want to do the opposite. We don't want to get a loudness that works for this section.
Back, I'm open and lonely and nobody asks. Can't cope with the slogans and too many.
Only to get here and find it doesn't work.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way?
Now, with that said, one of our techniques for getting things loud is getting things clear. The clearer we can get things, the better it's going to be. Now, I have to say I've done a fair amount of work. We went through the cue treatment in the last section. There's going to be a couple little things that I think we can kind of tighten up a little bit in terms of clarity. If we listen to the top end, for example, in this, we're going to hear there's a little bit of something happening in the very, very high frequencies that will probably get exacerbated if we start incurring any kind of distortion along the way.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day, we win the day.
It's not terribly offensive, but we hear it in the sibilances of the vocal. We hear it on this occasional very bright cymbal splash. There's just a lot of very bright tones in there. So one thing that we can do to help that along is use a de-esser, which is something that's probably not discussed too often in mastering, but it's a technique that a lot of really great mastering engineers, including some of my favorites, use. So we can find that very, very high, harsh frequency, and we can do some subtle de-essing just to kind of soften it a little bit. Yeah, that's it. Piercing. Yeah, so especially on the sibilances on the vocal, you see that this is really triggering pretty hard.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day, we win the day.
So that's subtle, but it's definitely going to make a difference when we start pushing up levels. When things start getting compressed, those high frequencies, they're going to get exacerbated. And when things start crunching a little bit, little crunch is okay, but if there's really high, harsh frequencies, they're going to start getting even harsher and grainier. So we're sort of heading that off at the pass. Now, in terms of just general clarity, this Gullfoss EQ is a really cool EQ. They have a whole thing on their website that I still don't understand. I actually got it wrong. I did a video on the Gullfoss EQ, and I kind of got it wrong. I was saying that it was kind of yielding toward a pink noise, but it's not really doing that. It's more like yielding towards some kind of modeled perception curve that was originally based on pink noise, but isn't actually pink noise. I don't know. Basically, the bottom line is this device is going to make things subtly clearer and fuller. And that's the bottom line to it. So it's a very, very subtle thing. I'm going to just bypass it without the window up so your eyes don't kind of interfere with what you're hearing, but I'll do a before and after.
All of emotions are holding me back.
Let's go to the chorus.
Light is casting shadow.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same.
After.
Light is casting shadow.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same.
And what you'll hear is the vocal feels a little fuller, the bass feels a little bit more forward and rounder, and the upper range, even though it's technically actually extending, it feels a little bit calmer, so to speak, I guess, for a lack of a better way of putting it. And it's all very, very subtle. So I'll bypass it, and then I'll bring it in and out every other measure.
Shadow.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day, we win the day.
The only caution I would say with this particular EQ is that it is a dynamic EQ, and so you can easily over-compress things if you overdo it. And it can trick you a little bit, because sometimes you'll do it and you'll be like, it sounds good, and you might not notice the compression right away. So you do have to approach this with a little bit of caution just to make sure you're not squelching your transients completely, because now we're about to squelch our transients completely. So, okay. I find that the best approach to getting a loud master is a combination of limiting and clipping. And what we want to aim for is a setting on both where we don't notice the damage that's being done, particularly with soft clipping. This is a real, very important precautionary thing here. If you can audibly hear the clipping, it's probably too much. The clipping should be happening over such a quick range of transient that you can barely detect it, and that you detect it more as like a color rather than like, oh, there's breakup going on. So those two things kind of go hand in hand and they play off each other. A good way to start is to grab a limiter. So let's do this. And to have something that has some kind of a gain matching. I find that that's a really important part. There's a lot of very competitive limiters out there. AOM limiter, Fab filter, which I'm using here, Slate FGX, Ozone Maximizer, or whatever it's called, and the list goes on. There's certainly more than that, and I'm going to talk about another one in a second called Master Plan, which is a really, really cool one, but it's a little bit more than a limiter. But all of those limiters are very competitive. A lot of the times, for me, the real personal pick thing that I choose a limiter for is actually the workflow, and a big one is being able to in and out match with our gain so that I know how the sound is changing without the actual level changing. It's really, really important. So I'm going to play this through, and my approach is generally to push this until it starts audibly sounding bad. Once I know that it's like, wow, okay, this is very noticeable, the average listener is clearly going to hear this, and it sounds bad, that's when I know I need to stop and start backing off.
Shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day. We win the day.
Shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the.
So there's a couple things that happen at different amounts of reduction. So I kind of stopped for a second at around like maybe 7 or 8 dB of gain. I was starting to hear a little bit of pumping happening, which is an artifact that, you know, somebody who's used to listening for that is going to hear. Average listener probably won't hear it. Now, here at +11, I'm starting to get distortion. I can audibly hear harmonic distortion occurring, particularly in the low end. It's not horrible, but it's starting to kind of low-res the sound of things a little bit.
Shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day.
I'm also starting to really rebalance my drums. So my snare is starting to get pushed underneath the vocal. My kick is starting to get pushed underneath the vocal. This is not inherently a bad thing unless it throws off the balances in a way that disrupts the groove or the feel of the record. And I would say that's also kind of happening here. I think the record can actually benefit from the vocal coming forward a little bit. So I don't mind a little bit of that happening, but I would say this is too much. So for me, we're well into the too much range for my tastes. With that said, you know, everybody's got a different thing, and sometimes people just go crazy, and like, look, if it feels good at the end of the day, even if it sounds kind of messed up, so be it. I don't believe in getting too precious about these things, but I also generally prefer that the record sound is, like, feel, not necessarily sound, but feel as good as it could. And sometimes the feel kind of gets messed up. Now, looking at the meter here, apparently I'm doing like 10 dB of gain reduction. That's a lot of gain reduction, and I'd like to point out that while this clearly has unappealing artifacts, it doesn't sound horrendous. It doesn't sound good, but it doesn't sound horrendous.
Shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same.
If I'm being honest, the distortion that's coming up doesn't bother me as much as the fact that the snare is pushed too low and there's too much pumping in the low end. So it's like, this is why that clarity thing I was talking about is really, really helpful, and comes from both the mix and the master phase. If we have something that has really good clarity in the mix treatment, you can push it this hot and the distortion is actually not terrible. It's not awful, except for on the snare. It's really bad. So, okay. Let's back it off from here. I think we've gone too far, and I think we've beaten this horse to death.
Shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day. We win the day.
Pull my way to my shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day. We win the.
Okay, so I kind of like this. We're losing a very tiny bit of low end. The kick is kind of squelching a couple of dB, and so it is rebalancing a little bit, but not in the worst way. So I think this is an okay compromise point. This is probably pretty screaming loud if we're being honest. And typically I find that with my mixes, I usually find, and I hate to put things in numbers, so please don't take this too seriously. Like, do not look at the meter to think that this is the way, but I find that typically, if I'm doing around 5 to maybe 7 dB of gain reduction, that tends to be where I like it. That is a general statement, by the way. Sometimes it's way less, sometimes it's way more. It usually depends on how dynamic the material is beforehand. Okay, let's talk about how dynamic the material is beforehand. So now we start playing the game of inches, right? This is where we start saying, okay, can we make this level, as loud as it is, let's say this is an acceptable level, can we make our loudness technique a little smoother? Is there something that we can do to maybe make things work out a little bit better? So there are certain things that we can do. For example, we could go in there and we could roll off deep subtone. Subtone, like I said, is what takes up the most space. If you roll off from the subaudible tones like this with a very wide Q starting around, your subaudible stuff. So I'm talking about like 10 to 20 hertz, but with a wide Q, we very gently ease off some of this like 40, 50, 60 hertz stuff, and sometimes that can make things sound a little bit better against the final limiter. So instead of making the limiter clamp down on our subtones, we're just doing it ourselves, basically.
Shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day, we win the day.
Now, that's not always going to sound good. In this particular case, I think it makes the record sound a little overly thin, but what you will notice is that with a lot of commercial releases, if you turn the level down and you pay really close attention to like the deep sub range, you'll actually find that they're a little thinner than you first realized. So if we're subtle about it and tactful about it, we can make that work. In this particular case, I think it's a little too obvious. I'm going to do it from like 10 or 12 hertz and see if that helps, maybe with a slightly tighter Q. And we're really targeting this like 30 to 50 hertz range here.
Shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day, we win the...
Yeah, and if we do it right, it can actually be aesthetically pleasing. Here, it sort of tightens up and focuses energy onto the kick drum, and I like it here. But this is a tough technique because you have to be able to monitor your deep lows pretty accurately, which requires sometimes a slightly sophisticated setup because that's where things tend to get goofy in room acoustics. And also, you need to be really discerning between very small degrees of difference. The difference between 15 hertz and 20 hertz is humongous. It's the same thing as the difference between 30 hertz and 40 hertz. It's the same thing as between 60 hertz and 80 hertz. When we start getting up to our more audible frequencies, when we get up to the high stuff, it's the difference between 150 and 200 hertz. It's the difference between 1500 and 2000 hertz. So you see, as we get higher, that proportion stretches more and more. A 5 hertz difference when we're talking about something in the 1K range, almost inaudible. A 5 hertz difference when we're talking about like 40 hertz versus 45 hertz, that's pretty significant. So we're really micromanaging very, very fine differences, and it's the same thing with this Q. Too steep of a roll-off is going to start hitting those higher frequencies. The stuff that's in the 80s, 90s, 100 hertz stuff, we're going to start losing our kick, and it's going to become depressing. But if we have too tight of a Q, then we're only targeting stuff we don't really hear and probably don't have really any significant energy with. So this is a tough technique to get down, basically, even though it looks simple. So okay, that's one thing we can do. The next thing we can do is we can try to get a more homogeneous effect from the limiter, and we can do that with soft clipping. So I'm going to pull up standard clip here, and I'm going to set the soft clip saturator to like 2%, so pretty close to hard clipping, but I'm going to keep it in soft clip mode. Soft clip pro because I'm a pro. I don't know. Because I hear a slightly better sound from this, and it's probably my imagination if we're being honest. So yeah, whatever, we're soft clipping, and we're going to pull this down, and basically we're going to pull this down until we no longer not hear it, so to speak. So when the snare or the kick starts to really get goofy.
Shadow.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day.
So I can hear it happening on the kick. We can hear the texture of the kick very specifically changing. I'm going to take off my limiter here so we can just kind of before and after this.
Shadow.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day. We win the day.
But even as much clipping as it's doing, it doesn't sound... It sounds more like color than it sounds like distortion. We have to pull it down a lot further to actually get into distortion.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same.
Okay, this is pretty horrible. So here we're hearing like very clear distortion, but you'll notice if we look at this little graph here, we're clipping everything.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight?
So obviously, you know, everything's getting distorted. So yeah, we're going to distort. But if we just focus on the highest peaks of the transients, like the kick and the snare.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the...
Before?
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight?
We hear almost no difference. So this can be really useful because if we're not really hearing a difference, but we're reducing level ahead of the limiter now is not going to have to work as hard. So when we throw the limiter back on...
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same.
Without?
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight?
With.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight?
It's subtle, but listen to how the low end breathes without the clipper. You'll notice there's a little bit of pumping. It's very subtle, but a little bit of pumping without the clip.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same.
Like the kick almost drags the record down a little bit when it hits. As soon as I put in the clipper, that doesn't happen.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same.
And we were also not really hearing too much color from the clipper. Like, I do hear a little bit of color, but very, very, very subtle. And I wouldn't even say it's bad. It actually sounds kind of good. We can also probably push into the clipper by about half a dB without really making it noticeable.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day.
Yeah, I would say I'm getting back that same degree of pump that I kind of mitigated before. So we're getting the same kind of pumping motion now, but we're about half a dB louder. And you might say, okay, well, big deal, it's half a dB, but let's bypass this real quick and just hear the difference half a dB makes in terms of total loudness.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day. We win the day.
0.6 dB, which is what it is not nothing. And when we're fighting at the very highest points of compression and limiting, those little differences is where we start going from like, I'm not really hearing much artifact. I know it's there because I know what to listen for and things like that, but I don't think the end listener is really going to care that much to like, okay, this is where the end listener is going to care. That's like a half dB to a dB difference usually when we get to like the extremes of our RMS levels. Okay, so fun combination there, but I do want to pull up one other plugin, and I want to pull it up because I've been using it a lot. I am going to qualify this by saying I do not have an endorsement with this company. I've actually never talked to anybody from this company before, but I sure plan to because I've been using the plugin a lot. But yeah, so this is not sponsored or anything like that, but it is going to kind of sound like an ad because I'm going to rave about the plugin. So there's the disclaimer for you. So it's called Master Plan. I believe it is replacing the FabFilter Pro L2 for me for the most part. However, it is a very, very different device than the FabFilter. I think for workflow and transparency in combination, the FabFilter Pro L2 is great. I recommend it 1000% for sure. This is not necessarily as transparent, but I also don't think that that's necessarily the intention behind it. I think the intention behind this is to create something that is an aesthetically pleasing loud master, and that is going to involve purposefully coloring things. I don't think that the actual limiter algorithm is necessarily the most transparent, but it does sound good. So, couple things to note on that. Okay, so first of all, this is clearly set up by people who understand what the mastering process is because of the way that we have controls over everything. There is it's not explicit, but there's sort of a built-in workflow to this. So first of all, I would start here with Unity. This is going to do the same thing that the gain matching with the FabFilter was doing. So this will allow us to turn it up and hear the results without the level getting louder necessarily. So I'm going to start just pushing this up, see what happens.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day. We win the day. Do the same, then do the same, then we win.
It's pretty transparent. Like, I do hear a little bit of color showing up on the kick, and it is reacting to the kick by pulling it down, which any limiter would do. But honestly, like, in a blind A/B, I don't think anybody would notice the difference in tone between, like, this and, say, like, AOM Invisible Limiter or FGX or Pro L2 or whatever you happen to be using. Like, it's way too subtle for that, in my opinion. One little criticism of this plugin, I really wish it went like -12 to +12, because some of us still do our gain staging like we did when we were working with analog consoles. You know, but yeah, a lot of people do run hotter, so I understand why it's only -6 to +6, but, you know, version 2, -12 to +12, please. Okay, now, from there, we also have a clipper, this thing that says loud. It is a algorithm that is incurring kind of a dirty limiter meets a clipper distortion kind of thing. It can get out of hand really quick, so you have to be pretty careful with it.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part, if you do the same.
Like, that sounds like a guitar pedal. So we've definitely gone too far. But let's back it off. Let's go somewhere that's a little bit cooler.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day.
Yeah, like 1 dB of it actually kind of brings in a nice, slightly growly quality to the bass. So while it's going to also make the record louder, it's also providing a tone and texture that's actually kind of cool. So finding that sweet spot is important. For my records, I've been noticing that somewhere between about half a dB, as low as half a dB on the clipper here, to maybe like 2 dB tends to be where I fall with it. Anything above that, I feel like I would be doing that as like a special effect, maybe using it on like drum bus or something like that, or on an individual track, which is one of the reasons why I like this plugin, because it also translates very nicely to use on individual buses and tracks. And then once we've got this kind of set up and we go, okay, this is not incurring too much damage, here's a quick little before and after.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day. We win the day.
Yeah, I think I'm going to even pull up like one little pinch of that. So let's do like 0.74.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way?
Yeah, that subtle thing makes it, like, mastering is an art of subtlety. It's really tough. But now we start to get all of the other stuff that I think makes this plugin really, really brilliant, because it's a plugin that anticipates the things that start happening when you start incurring compression and distortion. Your balances change. Your low end starts to change. Your high end can start to change. The way we start hearing things in terms of the density starts to change. So we get all sorts of fun little controls here. There's an additional saturation thing that makes things feel denser. This thing is great. I love this.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the...
So it's a really nice color. Obviously, we hear that very extremely. It's like we hear a strong pumping happen. We hear that the record literally thickens up. It colors up a lot. This is too much, but just a little dab of this can be really, really nice.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same.
Now, this deliberately works against the idea of transparency here. Most limiters are designed for transparency. This is why this is not quite exactly a limiter. It is a finalizing plugin. It's more than the limiter. Now, this does not work against this clean thing. Thick and clean, they sound like they should work against each other. They don't. Clean is really, really useful because as things start getting more dense, all that low-mid stuff can start to really build up. Low-mid and upper-mid can both start to build up, and both of those things are addressed in this plugin. I really find myself using this clean very often.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day.
It really eases off a lot of the distortion. I don't know if it's just an EQ or where it's placed in the chain, but it feels like distortion goes away, not just low mids, even though it's designed for low mids, but that's probably because of how the low mids are reacting.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same.
So here we have a multiband compressor. I don't find myself using this too often. I'm going to gloss over it. Smooth, I sometimes find myself using. However, it is more notably a compressor, and when compressors start reacting to heavy signal material, it can get pumpy. So it will reduce your distortion, but it's going to replace it with pumpiness. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day. We win the day.
But you'll notice that it does control the distortion that's happening, particularly in the upper mids, as a result of this compression. I don't think that's what it's officially doing. I think that that's just a result of how it sounds on this record. Another way to kind of ease off any kind of upper mid stuff is this calm control. I'll put it on 2x because it's pretty subtle, but it can be really, really useful.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day.
So the distortion and color chills out a lot, but the snare kind of gets compromised in the process. But we can find a sweet spot where it's like, okay, we lose maybe just a hair of snare, a snare of hair, a hair of snare, but we also get a smoother result.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same.
And then we have a tape saturator too, which will darken the record up a little bit, but does really nice things for the low end. I'll put it on full blast here.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win.
So you can hear a pretty distinct top end roll off, but I find that even at very, very, very low percentages of this, it has like a little nice thing it does in the lows.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same.
And I oftentimes use that to kind of regain the low end, the sense of the low end, when I'm hitting the compressor kind of hard, hitting the limiter kind of hard, I should say. And if there's any bit of top end roll off, just a little tap of this high end to compensate for what the tape is doing is really nice.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day. We win the day.
Pull my weight up by myself.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the.
And now we can just bypass it and bring it back in real quick.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull my way, can I pull my way? I do my part if you do the same. Then we win the day. We win the day.
Not bad. I think it's a little crunchy. Little crunchy. So I'm going to pull this thick control down even maybe a little further. I might even bypass it completely.
Pull my way, can I pull my way? Pull the same, then we win the day. We win. Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day.
And what I'm ultimately getting here is a very subtle crunch, but I don't dislike it. But I also know from this built-in LUFS meter that I have a pretty loud output here. This is going to get pretty competitively loud.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day. We win the day.
Pull my weight up by myself, but there's so much add.
I might need to push into it a little more. Minus 10 is probably not going to be quite loud enough. I probably want to go 1 more dB into it. So I might do something like just put a trim plugin in front. What did I end up on Pro? Yeah, so I had like 7 dB plus standard clip. So about 8 dB of loudness. This is a little short of that. So I probably need about 1 more dB a level going into it.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day. We win the day.
And then I would just compare it. Now I know from just experience that this is gonna get pretty freaking loud. I almost don't want to turn it up because I don't want to blow anybody's eardrums out, but you know, I'm gonna do that. So take a second to maybe turn down your monitors a little bit if you're already listening to this loud. I'm gonna take the Unity off and I'm gonna play it, and it's gonna play back pretty loud.
Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? Pull my weight, can I pull my weight? I do my part, if you do the same, then we win the day. We win the day.
That's plenty loud. I know that's plenty loud because I'm just really used to my system. I don't even have my monitor up to where I monitor for loudness completely. I'm still about like 2 dB short, and that sounds screaming loud to me. So we got there, plenty loud, no problem. All right, I'm going to wrap up there. If you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.